The Grand Galactic Unity Banquet was supposed to celebrate successful peace negotiations between 12 different species, but from where Captain Jack Sterling sat, it looked more like an elaborate social experiment in organized exclusion. Hundreds of diplomats, nobles, and military officers filled the vast dining hall aboard the Concordia, their conversations creating a symphony of languages and cultural exchanges that embodied the unity the evening was meant to commemorate. All except for one table near the center of the hall, where Lady Kira Shadowmere sat in perfect isolation. Jack had been observing the social dynamics for 2 hours now, and the bubble of empty space around the Nox High noblewoman was so conspicuous it might as well have been marked with warning signs. She was beautiful in the otherworldly way typical of her species, luminescent pale skin, elegant pointed ears, and violet eyes that seemed to hold depths of ancient wisdom. Her formal gown was exquisite, her posture regal, and her position at the table indicated high rank within the Shadow Dominion's political hierarchy. So why was she sitting completely alone while every other dignitary in the hall was surrounded by colleagues, admirers, or at least polite conversation partners? "Captain Sterling," said Ambassador Patricia Hayes, noticing his attention wandering from her discussion of trade route security, "I hope you're finding the evening educational." "Very educational," Jack replied, gesturing subtly toward Kira's isolated table. "Though I'm curious about the social dynamics. That woman appears to be someone important, but she's being treated like she has a contagious disease." Ambassador Hayes followed his gaze and her expression immediately grew uncomfortable. "Captain, that's Lady Kira Shadowmere of House Shadowmere. I'd strongly advise against any interaction with her." "Why? Political complications? More like personal safety." "Lady Shadowmere is." Hayes paused, clearly struggling with how to explain something that sounded ridiculous even to herself. "She's considered cursed. Bad things happen to people who associate with her closely." Jack stared at the ambassador, waiting for the punchline that never came. "You're serious? A curse? In the 24th century? Captain, I know how it sounds, but the pattern is undeniable." 3 years ago, Ambassador Chen spent an evening in deep conversation with Lady Shadowmere at a diplomatic reception. The next day, his ship suffered a catastrophic systems failure that killed 3 crew members. 2 years ago, General Morrison was photographed dancing with her at a charity gala. Within a week, he'd contracted a rare alien virus that ended his military career. Those sound like coincidences. 12 major incidents over 5 years, Captain. Always affecting people who've had significant contact with Lady Shadowmere. The galactic nobility may be sophisticated, but they're not stupid. They avoid her for reasons that go beyond superstition. Jack looked back at Kira, noting the way servers carefully avoided her table, how other guests actively changed their walking routes to maintain distance from her section of the hall. The isolation wasn't casual social awkwardness, it was systematic, deliberate, and so complete that it must have taken years to establish. So she just sits alone at every diplomatic function. For what, 5 years? Longer, actually. The incident started when she was quite young. She's learned to manage the situation. Manage it how? By accepting that her presence brings misfortune to others and minimizing social contact to protect people from potential harm. Ambassador Hayes's voice carried genuine sympathy despite her obvious fear. "Captain, Lady Shadowmere isn't a bad person. She's actually quite brilliant and has been instrumental in several important Shadow Dominion policies. But association with her carries risks that most people aren't willing to accept." Jack studied Kira's face, noting the composed expression that probably concealed years of practiced endurance. She held herself with dignity despite the obvious social exile, participated in the formal ceremonies when required, but otherwise remained as invisible as someone in her position could manage. Has anyone considered that maybe these incidents are coincidental? Or that someone might be deliberately creating problems for people who associate with her? "Captain," Ambassador Hayes said sharply, "I strongly advise against pursuing conspiracy theories about Shadow Dominion internal politics. Our diplomatic relations with the Nox High are complex enough without introducing additional complications. I'm not talking about conspiracy theories. I'm talking about basic fairness. That woman is sitting alone at a unity banquet because people think she's supernatural bad luck. Captain Sterling, some battles aren't worth fighting. Lady Shadowmere has adapted to her circumstances. Creating diplomatic incidents by challenging established social patterns would help no one. Jack watched as a group of young nobles deliberately walked past Kira's table, their conversation loud enough to be overheard as they discussed the latest rumors about her cursed influence on recent political developments. Kira's face remained impassive, but Jack caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested their words hit their intended target. Ambassador, has anyone ever actually tried treating her like a normal person to see what happens? Captain, the risks. The risks of basic courtesy. Of treating someone with dignity regardless of superstitious nonsense. Ambassador Hayes studied Jack with the expression of someone recognizing a stubborn streak that wouldn't be easily discouraged. Captain Sterling, Lady Shadowmere has been isolated for most of her adult life. She's learned to cope with loneliness as a necessary protection for others. Disrupting that adaptation could be cruel rather than kind. Jack looked back at Kira, who was now quietly eating her dinner while maintaining perfect posture despite being surrounded by hundreds of people who acted as if she were invisible. The image bothered him more than he wanted to admit, not just because of the obvious unfairness, but because her dignified endurance reminded him of his own experiences with military ostracism when he challenged popular but wrong-headed policies. Ambassador, he said finally, I think I'll judge the risks for myself. Captain, I strongly advise. But Jack was already standing, moving toward the center of the hall where Lady Kira Shadowmere sat alone at a table meant for 8, maintaining her composure in the face of systematic social cruelty that had apparently been accepted as normal by everyone who should have known better. As he walked across the dining hall, Jack became aware of conversations quieting, heads turning, and attention focusing on his approach to the one person everyone else had agreed to avoid. By the time he reached Kira's table, the entire banquet hall was watching to see if the human captain would suffer immediate misfortune for daring to challenge the curse that had isolated one of the galaxy's most powerful noblewomen for half a decade. Lady Shadowmere, Jack said quietly, pulling out the chair beside her and sitting down without ceremony, mind if I join you? The conversation at the other tables is getting a bit tedious. Lady Kira Shadowmere looked up from her untouched dinner with an expression that cycled through surprise, confusion, and something that might have been hope before settling into carefully controlled politeness. Captain Sterling, she said, her voice carrying the musical undertones typical of educated Nox High speech, are you certain you want to sit here? I'm certain I want to sit somewhere with interesting conversation, Jack replied, noting how her luminescent skin seemed to shimmer slightly with what appeared to be nervous energy. Unless you prefer dining alone. Kira glanced around the hall, where hundreds of guests were still watching their interaction with obvious fascination and concern. Captain, I should warn you that my company is considered problematic by most galactic society. So I've heard. Something about a curse that brings bad luck to anyone who associates with you. Kira's expression grew pained, as if the casual mention of her reputation caused physical discomfort. The pattern of incidents is undeniable. People who spend time with me often experience unfortunate coincidences that could happen to anyone, Jack interrupted gently. Lady Shadowmere, I've read the incident reports. I've also spent 15 years in military service, which teaches you to distinguish between actual threats and imaginary ones based on evidence rather than fear. And what does your analysis suggest? That you've been remarkably unlucky in your timing, but that correlation doesn't equal causation. Also that you've handled 5 years of social isolation with more grace than most people would manage. Kira stared at him with the expression of someone hearing a foreign language that somehow made perfect sense. You don't believe in the curse. I believe in bad luck, poor timing, and the human tendency to find patterns in random events. I also believe in treating people with basic dignity regardless of superstitious nonsense. Captain Sterling, the incidents. are tragic coincidences that have been turned into social mythology for reasons that probably have more to do with politics than supernatural influence. Jack watched as Kira processed this perspective, her violet eyes holding depths of loneliness that made him wonder how anyone could maintain sanity under such complete social isolation. "You realize," she said carefully, "that by sitting with me, you're associating yourself with someone the galactic nobility considers genuinely dangerous. I'm associating myself with someone who's been treated unfairly based on circumstances beyond her control. But what if you're wrong? What if the curse is real and my presence brings harm to people I..." She paused, seeming to struggle with expressing vulnerability after years of emotional self-protection. "Then I'll deal with whatever consequences arise," Jack said firmly. "But I won't participate in social cruelty disguised as supernatural caution." Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of Lord Demon Blackthorn, a Nox High noble whose elaborate formal wear and predatory smile marked him as exactly the kind of political schemer Jack had learned to distrust during his diplomatic assignments. "Captain Sterling," Lord Blackthorn said with smooth malice, "how brave of you to join Lady Shadowmere's table. Though I feel compelled to mention, for your own safety, that such associations have historically proven unfortunate for those involved." "Lord Blackthorn," Jack replied evenly, "I appreciate your concern, but I'm capable of evaluating risks for myself." "Of course. Though one wonders if human military training adequately prepares one for the supernatural influences that affect those who..." He gestured vaguely toward Kira with theatrical concern. "Well, who spend time in certain company." Jack felt his temper rising at the casual cruelty disguised as polite warning. "Lord Blackthorn, are you suggesting that Lady Shadowmere poses some kind of active threat to other guests?" "I suggest nothing. I merely observe that patterns exist for those wise enough to recognize them. And I observe that treating someone as a social pariah based on coincidental timing is more reflective of character flaws in the observers than supernatural influence in the observed." Lord Blackthorn's smile became genuinely predatory at the challenge. "How fascinating. Captain Sterling, would you be willing to test your convictions against reality? Perhaps a small wager regarding your continued good fortune over the remainder of the evening? I don't gamble on other people's reputations or welfare." Pity. It would have been educational to document the results of extended exposure to Lady Shadowmere's unique influence. After Lord Blackthorn departed with obvious satisfaction at having created social drama, Kira turned to Jack with an expression that mixed gratitude with concern. "Captain Sterling, you shouldn't have challenged him. Lord Blackthorn has considerable political influence, and antagonizing him over my situation could damage your career. My career can survive being associated with someone whose only crime is bad timing. But what if it's more than bad timing?" Kira's voice grew quiet with years of internalized fear. "Captain, I've spent so many years watching people I care about suffer misfortunes after spending time with me. Even if the connection is coincidental, the results are real. People get hurt." "Kira," Jack said, using her name without title for the first time, "how long since someone treated you like a normal person rather than a walking disaster?" She was quiet for a long moment, her expression suggesting she was calculating time periods that spoke to profound isolation. "Several years. Most interactions are formal, brief, and conducted at safe distances." "And how has that isolation affected you personally?" "It's lonely," she admitted with the kind of honesty that suggested she rarely allowed herself to acknowledge emotional needs. "But loneliness is preferable to watching people I care about suffer because of my presence." Jack studied her face, noting the way years of social exile had taught her to suppress normal human needs for connection and companionship in favor of protecting others from potential harm. "Kira, what if I told you that your isolation might be causing more harm than any supposed curse? That watching you suffer alone is probably more painful for people who care about you than any coincidental mishaps they might experience. I would say that you don't understand the severity of the incidents involved. And I would say that you've been convinced to accept responsibility for tragedies that were never your fault in the first place." As they continued their conversation, Jack became aware that the dining hall's attention remained focused on their table, with various guests clearly expecting some dramatic manifestation of the curse that was supposed to make association with Kira dangerous. The weight of that expectation was creating exactly the kind of social pressure that could turn minor accidents into major incidents through the power of suggestion and collective anxiety. "Kira," he said quietly, "I think your curse might be less supernatural and more social than anyone realizes. And I suspect that's exactly what some people want to maintain." As the evening progressed, Jack's conversation with Kira revealed layers of intelligence, humor, and resilience that made her isolation seem even more tragic and unnecessary. She was well educated in galactic politics, possessed insights into interspecies relations that impressed even his diplomatic background, and demonstrated the kind of thoughtful analysis that should have made her a valued advisor rather than a social pariah. "Your perspective on the Centaurian trade negotiations is fascinating," Jack said, genuinely engaged by her political insights. "Most analysts miss the cultural implications of their proposal structure. When you spend years observing social dynamics from the outside, you notice patterns that participants might miss," Kira replied with self-deprecating humor that didn't quite hide the pain behind her words. "That kind of analytical distance could be incredibly valuable in diplomatic contexts. It could be, if anyone were willing to risk association with someone whose presence allegedly brings misfortune to important negotiations." Their conversation was interrupted by the first of what would become a series of minor incidents that seemed to validate the curse rumors. A server carrying drinks stumbled near their table, spilling wine across the white tablecloth and narrowly missing Kira's elegant gown. The incident drew immediate attention from nearby guests, who exchanged meaningful glances and whispered comments about the curse manifesting right on schedule. "I'm terribly sorry," the server said, but Jack noticed that his apology was directed toward the table rather than toward Kira specifically, as if acknowledging her directly might increase the supernatural risk. "Accidents happen," Jack said calmly, helping to clean up the spill while noting how the server seemed unusually nervous for someone dealing with a routine mishap. "Captain Sterling," Kira said quietly, her voice carrying resignation that suggested she'd experienced similar incidents many times before, "perhaps you should." "Should what?" "Leave because someone spilled wine." "Kira, servers have been spilling drinks at formal dinners since the invention of formal dinners." But even as he said it, Jack was observing details that didn't quite fit normal accident patterns. The server's nervousness seemed disproportionate, his route to their table had been unnecessarily indirect, and his stumble had occurred at exactly the moment when maximum attention would be focused on their interaction. 20 minutes later, a minor malfunction caused the holographic display above their section of the hall to flicker and produce distorted images during a ceremonial presentation. Again, nearby guests immediately focused on Kira with expressions that mixed fear and satisfaction at having their supernatural beliefs confirmed. "The curse strikes again," murmured Lord Blackthorne from a nearby table, his voice carrying just far enough to be overheard by surrounding guests. Jack was beginning to recognize a pattern, but it wasn't supernatural influence, it was orchestrated social theater designed to maintain Kira's isolation through manufactured evidence of her dangerous nature. "Kira," he said quietly, "have you ever noticed that these incidents tend to happen when you're being watched by people who expect them to happen?" "What do you mean?" "I mean that two minor mishaps in one evening, both occurring at moments of maximum social visibility, suggests timing that's more deliberate than coincidental." Kira's expression grew thoughtful as she considered the implication. "You think someone is deliberately creating incidents to maintain the curse mythology?" "I think some people benefit from your isolation and have learned to encourage the social dynamics that perpetuate it." Before Kira could respond, a third incident occurred that was too obvious to ignore. A young diplomat at a nearby table suddenly clutched his throat and began choking, creating immediate drama and panic that drew attention throughout the hall. Several guests immediately looked toward Kira with expressions of horror and accusation, while others rushed to help the afflicted diplomat. But Jack had been watching when the incident began, and he'd seen the diplomat carefully palm something from his dinner plate before the choking episode started. More tellingly, the man's distress seemed performative rather than genuinely medical, his coloring remained normal, his breathing passages were clearly functional, and his recovery was suspiciously rapid once medical attention arrived. Remarkable timing, Jack observed, loud enough to be heard by surrounding tables. 3 incidents in 2 hours, all occurring while everyone's watching for evidence of supernatural influence. Captain Sterling, Lord Blackthorne said with malicious satisfaction, surely even you must recognize the pattern by now. Lady Shadowmere's presence creates complications for those around her. I recognize a pattern, Jack agreed, standing from his chair with the kind of controlled anger that made his military background obvious. But it's not supernatural influence, it's deliberate manipulation designed to maintain social cruelty through manufactured evidence. The accusation created immediate tension throughout the dining hall, with conversation stopping as guests turned to observe what appeared to be developing into a public confrontation. Captain Sterling, Kira said urgently, please don't. Don't what? Don't challenge the social conspiracy that's kept you isolated for years based on fake incidents and manufactured coincidences. Jack's voice carried across the hall with military projection that made his words audible to most of the assembled guests. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been watching 3 supernatural incidents this evening, all perfectly timed to occur when maximum attention was focused on Lady Shadowmere's table. Coincidence? Or orchestrated theater designed to perpetuate harmful social mythology? Lord Blackthorne's expression grew dangerous at having his manipulation exposed so publicly. Captain Sterling, your accusations are both unfounded and diplomatically inappropriate. My accusations are based on direct observation of behavior patterns that any military intelligence officer would recognize as deliberate misinformation campaigns. Jack gestured toward the diplomat who had been choking minutes earlier and was now showing no signs of distress whatsoever. Notice how quickly our medical emergency resolved once it had served its dramatic purpose. Notice how each incident occurred at exactly the moment when it would reinforce existing prejudices about Lady Shadowmere's supposed curse. The hall had grown completely silent, with hundreds of guests watching as Jack systematically dismantled the supernatural explanation that had justified years of social cruelty toward someone whose only crime was being vulnerable to political manipulation. Captain Sterling, Kira said, her voice carrying wonder and terror in equal measure, you're challenging the entire social structure that's governed my life for 5 years. I'm challenging social cruelty disguised as supernatural caution, Jack replied firmly. And I'm suggesting that maybe it's time everyone else did the same. As murmurs began spreading throughout the hall and guests started questioning their own assumptions about the curse that had isolated Lady Shadowmere, Jack realized he had just initiated a confrontation that would either free Kira from years of unjust exile or make them both targets of the political forces that had benefited from maintaining her isolation. Either way, the evening's entertainment was about to become far more dramatic than anyone had planned. The confrontation that followed Jack's public challenge transformed the banquet from diplomatic celebration into something approaching a trial, with Kira's reputation and Jack's accusations as the central evidence in a debate that had been suppressed for years through social pressure and supernatural fear. Captain Sterling, said Ambassador Vrex of the Alterian Council, stepping forward as an unofficial mediator, these are serious allegations about deliberate manipulation of social dynamics. Do you have evidence to support your claims? Jack gestured toward the various incident locations throughout the hall. Ambassador Vrex, I have direct observational evidence of 3 incidents this evening that were clearly staged to occur at moments of maximum dramatic impact. I also have patterns of behavior from certain individuals who seem remarkably invested in maintaining Lady Shadowmere's isolation. And what would be the motivation for such manipulation? Political advantage, social control, or simply the entertainment value of having a designated outcast to make everyone else feel superior by comparison. Lord Blackthorne stepped forward with predatory confidence. Captain Sterling, your accusations are based on speculation and conspiracy theories. The incidents surrounding Lady Shadowmere are documented historical facts. The incidents are documented facts, Jack interrupted. The supernatural causation is unsupported interpretation designed to justify treating someone as a social disease. Then perhaps, suggested Lady Evangeline Nightshade, another Nox High Noble, Captain Sterling would be willing to demonstrate his convictions through extended association with Lady Shadowmere. A week-long diplomatic assignment, perhaps, during which any complications could be properly documented. The challenge was clearly intended to force Jack into either backing down from his accusations or accepting risk that might validate the curse rumors through actual misfortune. But Jack had spent enough time in combat zones to recognize a tactical trap that was also an opportunity. "I accept," he said immediately, before anyone could object to the arrangement. 1 week of normal professional association with Lady Shadowmere, during which any incidents will be investigated for natural causes before supernatural explanations are considered. Kira turned to him with expression that mixed gratitude with horror. "Captain Sterling, you don't understand what you're agreeing to. The patterns. The patterns will be broken," Jack said firmly, "because we're going to approach this situation with scientific methodology rather than superstitious fear." Ambassador Hayes approached with obvious concern about the diplomatic implications of the arrangement. "Captain Sterling, if you're wrong about this, the consequences could extend far beyond personal misfortune. And if I'm right, we'll have exposed and ended years of systematic social cruelty based on manufactured evidence and deliberate manipulation." The week that followed proved to be one of the most intense investigations of Jack's military career, but instead of searching for enemies or strategic threats, he was documenting social dynamics and tracing the sources of coincidental mishaps that seemed to follow their professional interactions. Working together on a joint human-Nox-High diplomatic initiative, Jack and Kira quickly discovered that their professional partnership was remarkably effective. Her insights into galactic politics combined with his military strategic background to produce analyses that impressed even skeptical observers. More importantly, Jack's methodical investigation of each minor incident that occurred during their collaboration revealed patterns of deliberate sabotage and manufactured coincidence that had been sustaining the cursed mythology for years. The communication system malfunction was caused by a specific code sequence that could only be input by someone with administrative access, Jack reported to the investigating committee on their 4th day together. The food poisoning incident involved a toxin that doesn't occur naturally in any of the ingredients we consumed. The transport delay was caused by falsified maintenance reports that created unnecessary mechanical problems. "You're suggesting," Ambassador Vreck said carefully, "that every incident this week was deliberately caused by individuals seeking to maintain Lady Shadowmere's cursed reputation." "I'm proving it through documentation, witness testimony, and forensic analysis that would stand up in any military tribunal." Lord Blackthorne made one final attempt to preserve the social dynamic that had benefited him for years. "Captain Sterling, even if recent incidents were artificially created, that doesn't explain the historical pattern of misfortunes that established Lady Shadowmere's reputation initially." "Actually, it does," Kira said, speaking publicly about her situation for the first time in years. "Captain Sterling's investigation helped me realize that most of the historical incidents occurred during events where you were present, Lord Blackthorne. Events where you had access to the systems that failed, the food that caused illness, the transportation that malfunctioned." "You're accusing me of..." "I'm accusing you of 5 years of systematic harassment disguised as supernatural influence, designed to keep me isolated and politically weakened while you built influence within Shadow Dominion circles." The evidence that Jack and Kira had assembled was overwhelming. Documents showing Blackthorne's access to compromised systems, testimony from accomplices who had been paid to create minor accidents, and most damning, communication records showing coordination between various nobles who had been maintaining Kira's isolation for their own political benefit. The curse, Jack announced to the assembled diplomatic community, was always a social conspiracy dressed up as supernatural influence. Lady Shadowmere's only crime was being vulnerable to political manipulation by individuals who benefited from her exile. The resolution of the investigation led to formal censure of Lord Blackthorne and his co-conspirators, public acknowledgement that Kira had been the victim of systematic harassment rather than supernatural influence, and her restoration to full participation in galactic diplomatic society. But more personally, the week of working together had revealed the depth of connection possible between two individuals who valued truth over convenience and justice over social comfort. "Any regrets about challenging the curse that isolated me for 5 years?" Kira asked as they reviewed their successful joint diplomatic initiative. "Only that it took me so long to sit down beside you," Jack replied, their professional partnership having evolved into personal relationship built on mutual respect and shared commitment to treating people fairly regardless of social mythology. "I was beginning to think I'd spend the rest of my life sitting alone at formal dinners." "Never again," Jack said, taking her hand in a gesture that was noticed and approved by the diplomatic community that had learned to celebrate connection over isolation. "From now on, you'll have to save me a seat." Their relationship became a symbol of the power of individual courage to challenge unjust social systems, proving that sometimes the most important battles are fought not against external enemies but against the cruelty that societies create and maintain through fear, superstition, and the convenience of having someone to blame for random misfortune. The banquet hall where Kira had once sat alone now hosted celebrations of their diplomatic successes, with Jack beside her as both professional partner and personal companion who had discovered that sometimes the most powerful magic is simply refusing to participate in social cruelty disguised as supernatural caution.